A perfect day turned upside down. It was supposed to be the perfect day. The weather was ideal, a sunny summer afternoon where everything seemed to gleam. The amusement park buzzed with life. Laughter echoed through the air as families moved between rides. Colorful stands sold sweet treats, and children's giggles mixed with the clanking of roller coasters. This was a place where worries should melt away, replaced by joy and excitement. Maria sat quietly in her wheelchair, watching her son, Adam, run ahead of her. His short legs bounced with each step as he zigzagged between the crowds, barely able to contain his excitement. Adam had been talking about this day for weeks. He was obsessed with the rides, especially the Ferris wheel that loomed in the distance. Maria had promised they would ride it first, a memory he would cherish forever. But Maria wasn't just any visitor at the park. She was 7 months pregnant, and her pregnancy had been anything but smooth. A rare medical condition had developed, one that made walking difficult, forcing her to use a wheelchair for mobility. Despite the discomfort, Maria refused to let anything ruin this day for her son. Her husband, David, was supposed to join them later. He was a busy man, his work demanding and unpredictable. David had been an FBI agent for over a decade, and his job often took him to places Maria couldn't follow. Sometimes, days passed without them talking, as his assignments kept him off the grid. Still, their bond was strong, and when he was home, he was the kind of father and husband who was fully present. Today, though, he had been called into work for an urgent meeting, but promised he would catch up to them soon. Maria took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her pregnancy and the strain on her body. She looked at Adam and smiled. No matter how exhausted she felt, her son's joy was worth everything. She wheeled herself towards the disability entrance, hoping to make this as easy as possible. As they approached the designated entrance, Maria noticed a police officer stationed at the gate. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an imposing presence, his face hard and expressionless. Something about his posture felt off. His eyes scanned the crowd with a hint of suspicion, and when he locked onto Maria, she felt an immediate sense of unease. "Mom, can we go now? I want to see the Ferris wheel." Adam tugged at her sleeve, pulling her back to the moment. "Just a second, honey," she said, trying to steady her nerves. She rolled her wheelchair up to the entrance, taking out her pass for disabled access. "Good afternoon," Maria said, offering a polite smile as she handed over her documentation. "I have my medical pass for the park's accessibility services. I just need to get through with my son." The officer barely glanced at the pass. His cold eyes shifted from her to Adam, and then back to her again, lingering on her wheelchair. He seemed unimpressed, and his tone was anything but welcoming. "Are you sure you need this entrance?" His voice was low, but the skepticism was clear. "You don't look like someone who needs special treatment." Maria blinked, caught off guard by the hostility in his words. "I do," she replied, her voice steady but confused. "I'm pregnant, and I have medical complications that prevent me from walking." The officer's eyes narrowed. "We've had too many people trying to take advantage of the system lately," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "You know, lying about disabilities just to cut lines or get free access." The implication of his words hit Maria like a punch to the stomach. Was he accusing her of lying? "I'm not lying," she said, her voice firmer now. "I have medical documents if you need to see them. I just want my son to have a fun day at the park." But the officer wasn't listening. He glanced at her with disdain and waved his hand dismissively. "Look, lady, we deal with all kinds of fraud here. You people think you can pull one over on us just because you're in a wheelchair, but I'm not buying it." Maria felt her face flush with anger. "You people." She repeated his words slowly, the sting of them sinking in. "I'm not trying to pull anything. I'm pregnant. I'm in a wheelchair because I can't walk, and I have every right to be here." Her calm, composed tone was beginning to waver, and Adam, sensing the tension, tugged on her arm. "Mom, what's wrong? Can we go in now?" Maria looked down at her son, trying to muster a smile, but her heart was racing. She had read too many stories about situations like this. Simple misunderstandings spiraling out of control, especially for people of color. She was a black woman in a wheelchair, and now she was being treated like a criminal for simply wanting to access a public park with her son. The officer leaned in closer, his face hovering just above hers. "I think I'm going to have to call this in," he said, pulling out his radio. "We can't take any chances with people like you." Maria's heart sank. People like you. The words echoed in her mind. She felt powerless, sitting there while this man, who was supposed to protect the public, treated her with contempt. She knew calling the police would only make things worse, but what choice did she have? "Mom, are we in trouble?" Adam's voice was small, filled with fear. His wide eyes darted between his mother and the officer, not fully understanding the situation, but knowing something was wrong. Maria's chest tightened. This was not how today was supposed to go. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm for Adam's sake, but inside, a storm was brewing. "We're not in trouble, sweetie," she said softly, reaching out to touch his cheek. "We're just waiting for someone to help us." But the officer had already called for backup. Maria's stomach churned as she watched him speak into his radio, relaying their location and situation as if she were some kind of threat. Her hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair tightly, her knuckles turning white. This was supposed to be a day of joy, but now it felt like a nightmare. The sounds of the amusement park faded into the background as Maria's world became smaller, focused entirely on the looming confrontation. People were starting to gather, sensing the tension in the air. Whispered conversations buzzed around her, and she could feel their eyes on her, judging, speculating. What would David think when he arrived? Her husband was always calm under pressure, always ready to diffuse any situation. But right now, she needed to stay strong for herself and for Adam. The officer's radio crackled again. "On our way," a voice responded. "ETA 3 minutes. 3 minutes." Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She had 3 minutes to figure out how to protect her son from the scene that was about to unfold. The storm brews. The tension in the air was suffocating as Maria sat helplessly in her wheelchair. The officer who had called for backup stood firm, his arms crossed, watching her as though he were waiting for her to make a wrong move. Around her, the once joyous sounds of the amusement park seemed to blur into a dull hum. The laughter of children, the rush of roller coasters, the clanging of games, it all faded as her focus narrowed on the growing crowd around her and the police officer's hard stare. Adam stood beside her, his small hand gripping the armrest of the wheelchair tightly. His wide eyes darted nervously from the officer to his mother, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Maria could feel her son's anxiety as a mirror to her own, but she couldn't afford to panic. Not now. She had to stay strong for him, even though her heart raced and her mind swirled with dread. "Why don't we just go to another entrance?" Adam suggested, his innocent voice breaking the silence. He tugged at her sleeve, hoping to ease the situation. "We don't have to stay here, Mommy." Maria's heart ached as she looked at him, his young face creased with worry. How could she explain to him that the issue wasn't about finding another entrance? It wasn't about accessibility or paperwork anymore. The situation had turned into something much darker, something that no mother wanted her child to witness. She swallowed her fear and forced a gentle smile. "It's okay, sweetie. We're not doing anything wrong. We just need to be patient." Her voice was soft, but the underlying tension was impossible to mask. She looked up at the officer again. His eyes hadn't left her since the moment she rolled up to the gate. There was a hardness in his gaze, a kind of suspicion that she couldn't quite understand. Maria had seen that look before, on people who assumed the worst about her before even knowing her name. It was the look of someone who had already decided who you were, regardless of facts or evidence. Time seemed to stretch as they waited. Maria's mind raced, trying to think of ways to de-escalate the situation before it got out of hand. She knew what could happen when things spiraled with authority figures, especially for people like her. David had warned her many times about how quickly encounters with law enforcement could go wrong, especially for black people in America. But no amount of preparation could fully equip someone for the real thing. Where is David? The thought flashed through her mind like a beacon of hope. If only he were here, this would be different. He was an FBI agent after all. He knew how to handle situations like this with grace and authority. But today, she was on her own. She had to stand her ground, even though she felt powerless sitting in her wheelchair, pregnant and vulnerable. A small crowd had gathered now, people stopping to watch the scene unfold. Whispers spread among them, their faces etched with curiosity and confusion. Some took out their phones, recording the interaction, which only added to Maria's growing sense of discomfort. "Do you see what's going on?" One woman whispered to her companion, not bothering to keep her voice low. "She's trying to cut the line using that wheelchair." "I don't know," her friend replied, eyeing Maria skeptically. "Looks like she's trying to pull something. These days, people will do anything for special treatment." The words cut Maria deeply, though she did her best not to let it show. She had been taught her whole life to rise above situations like this, to be the better person and not let other people's ignorance define her. But it was hard, so hard, when she was being humiliated in front of her son. Finally, the distant sound of approaching sirens broke through the noise of the park. Maria's stomach twisted into a tight knot. This wasn't what she had wanted. She had hoped the officer would reconsider, would see that she was just a mother trying to spend the day with her child. But now the police were coming, and the situation felt like it was slipping out of her control. The officer glanced down at her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as the sound of the sirens grew louder. "They'll be here any minute," he said, his tone smug. "We'll see what they have to say about all this." Maria wanted to scream, to shout at him for making assumptions about her, for treating her like a criminal when all she had done was ask for access to a ride for her son. But she knew that would only make things worse. Instead, she forced herself to stay calm, breathing deeply to keep the rising tide of anger and frustration at bay. As the police car pulled up to the gate, a ripple of anticipation spread through the crowd. People leaned in, eager to see what would happen next. The car door opened, and out stepped two uniformed officers, a man and a woman. They approached the scene with calm, practiced steps, their faces unreadable. The female officer was the first to speak. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, looking between Maria and the security officer at the gate. "She's trying to get through the disability entrance without proper verification," the security officer replied before Maria could speak. "I've seen a lot of people faking it, and I called you to check it out." Maria's blood boiled at his words, but she took a deep breath before responding. "I have medical documentation," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "I'm 7 months pregnant, and I have complications that prevent me from walking. I just want to take my son on a few rides. That's all." The male officer looked at her, his gaze less hostile than the security guards but still guarded. "Do you have your documents with you?" he asked. Maria nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out the folder she had been carrying. She handed it to the officer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please, let this be enough," she thought. "Please, just let us enjoy our day in peace." The officer took the folder and opened it, scanning the medical papers inside. His face remained neutral as he read, though Maria could see the gears turning in his mind. The female officer stood beside him, watching the scene unfold with the same detached professionalism. After what felt like an eternity, the officer closed the folder and handed it back to Maria. "Everything seems to be in order," he said finally, his tone neutral. "You're free to use the disability entrance." A wave of relief washed over Maria, but it was short-lived. The security officer at the gate frowned, clearly unhappy with the decision. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. I've seen people fake this before." The male officer shot him a look. "Her paperwork is valid. There's no reason to keep her from entering." Maria glanced at Adam, who had been watching everything unfold in silence. His small face was tense, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. This wasn't the fun day at the park she had promised him. She felt a surge of guilt, knowing that he had been forced to witness all of this, but there was nothing she could do now but move forward. As the police officers turned to leave, Maria wheeled herself toward the entrance, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline that still coursed through her veins. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the whispers and stares that followed her. All she wanted was to get through the gate, to give her son the day of joy he deserved. But just as she started to move, the security officer stepped forward again, blocking her path. "I still think there's something off about this," he muttered, his voice low but audible. "You people always find a way to game the system." Maria froze, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She had heard enough. The thin veneer of politeness she had been holding onto finally cracked, and a wave of anger surged up from deep within her. "You people," she said, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The officer smirked, his eyes glinting with arrogance. "You know exactly what I mean," he replied. And in that moment, as the weight of his words hung in the air, Maria felt something inside her shift. She had been patient. She had stayed calm. But there was only so much a person could take before they had to stand up for themselves. Just then, a figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. A tall man, dressed in casual clothes but moving with purpose, pushed his way through the onlookers. His presence was commanding, and as he got closer, Maria's heart leaped with recognition. David had arrived. Unveiling truth and power. David's arrival was like the first ray of light after a long, dark night. His tall, broad frame cut through the crowd with the ease and confidence of someone used to taking control of volatile situations. Maria's heart lifted as she saw him. Though the tension in her body remained, even with her husband here, she knew this wasn't over yet. David's experience as an FBI agent had taught him how to read situations quickly, and she could already see the flicker of concern in his eyes as he assessed the scene. David's gaze moved from Maria, who was still seated in her wheelchair, to the police officers standing off to the side, and finally to the security officer blocking the entrance. His jaw tightened as he pieced together what had happened in the moments before his arrival. He didn't rush in, didn't raise his voice. That wasn't David's way. Instead, he approached with calm authority, the kind of presence that made people listen before they even realized they were doing so. The security officer hadn't noticed him yet. He was too busy maintaining his stance, still blocking the entrance as if Maria and Adam were a threat to park security. His last words, "You people," echoed in Maria's ears, and she could feel the anger she had tried so hard to suppress bubbling back to the surface. But before she could speak, David was there, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, his voice a grounding force. "I'm here. Tell me what happened." Maria looked up at him, the flood of emotions making it difficult to speak. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy, but she managed to tell him about the confrontation. The guard's refusal to accept her medical documents, the dismissive comments, and the insinuation that she was trying to cheat the system. As she spoke, David's face remained calm, but his eyes darkened, his jaw clenching ever so slightly. When she finished, David straightened and turned his attention to the security officer, who was still standing in front of the entrance, seemingly oblivious to the man who had just joined the scene. David's voice was firm, but measured as he spoke. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. "Is there a reason you're preventing my wife from entering this park after she's shown you valid documentation?" The security officer, taken aback by David's calm authority, turned to face him. His eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and defiance. "She doesn't look like she needs special access," he replied, his voice gruff. "And I'm not convinced those papers are legitimate." David's eyes narrowed slightly, but his composure didn't falter. "I'm sorry. Are you a doctor?" he asked, his voice dripping with the kind of cool professionalism that only someone trained in high-stakes negotiations could pull off. Because as far as I can tell, her medical condition has been verified by healthcare professionals. You've seen her papers, and unless you have any other valid reason to prevent her from entering, I suggest you step aside. The security officer's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who spoke with such authority. For a moment, he seemed to struggle for words, but the presence of the growing crowd, the police officers, and now David was making it clear that his stance was becoming increasingly untenable. "I don't have to explain myself to you," the officer muttered, though his bravado was clearly beginning to wane. "I was just doing my job, trying to keep the system fair." David took another step closer, his height and build making him an imposing figure, though he didn't raise his voice or make any threatening movements. "Keeping the system fair," David repeated. "That's interesting, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're abusing your position of authority to make assumptions about someone based on their appearance. My wife is a black woman in a wheelchair, pregnant, and here with our son. She's followed every rule, provided every document you asked for, and yet you're still treating her as if she's done something wrong." David's words were calm but loaded with meaning. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, just a simple, clear truth. And that truth was enough to silence the murmurs in the crowd, to still the smugness that had lingered in the security officer's posture. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, glanced over at the police officers for backup, but they remained where they were, hands on their belts but not intervening. The male officer, who had reviewed Maria's papers earlier, seemed to be weighing his options, watching the exchange with growing unease. He had done his part by verifying the documents, and now it was clear that the problem was no longer with Maria's paperwork. David stepped back, giving the security officer room to save face. "All we want is to enter the park," he said, "just like everyone else here. There's no need for any more drama. So unless you're going to escalate this further, I suggest you let us through." The crowd had grown larger, and their mood was shifting. Where before there had been whispers of suspicion, there was now a palpable sense of unease. People were beginning to realize that what they were witnessing was more than just a routine dispute. It was a moment where lines had been crossed, where an innocent family was being treated unfairly. For a moment, it seemed like the security officer might dig in his heels, but then the female police officer finally spoke. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Sir," she addressed the security officer, "we've reviewed the paperwork, and everything checks out. There's no reason to prevent them from entering the park." The security officer opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. With a frustrated sigh, he stepped aside, allowing Maria, David, and Adam to pass through. But the damage had been done. The smirk on his face, the dismissive tone in his voice, those were things that would linger in Maria's memory long after this day. Maria's hands trembled as she gripped the wheels of her chair, but she forced herself to move forward. David stayed by her side, his hand still resting protectively on her shoulder, while Adam clung to her other arm, his small face tight with worry. They moved past the gate, through the crowd, and into the park, leaving the chaos behind them. But even as they crossed the threshold, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted inside her. "Are you okay?" David asked quietly as they reached a quieter area of the park. He crouched down next to her, his eyes full of concern. Maria nodded, though her mind was still racing. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice sounded distant, even to herself. "I just didn't expect all of that." David sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he said, "if I had known." "It's not your fault," Maria interrupted, reaching out to touch his arm. "I'm just tired. I didn't want to make a scene, but it felt like everything I did just made things worse." David's expression softened as he took her hand. "You handled it better than most people would have," he said. "That guy was a jerk, And you kept your cool. I'm proud of you." Maria smiled weakly, but the exhaustion was beginning to set in. She had spent so much energy holding herself together, staying calm for Adam's sake, that now she felt drained. All she had wanted was a simple day at the park with her family, but now that seemed like an impossible dream. "Mommy," Adam said quietly, his voice breaking through her thoughts, "are we still gonna ride the Ferris wheel?" Maria looked at her son, his wide eyes full of hope, and for the first time since the confrontation, she felt a flicker of joy. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her smile growing a little stronger. "We're still going to ride the Ferris wheel. Nothing's going to stop us." David straightened up, his hand still resting on her shoulder as they started moving toward the ride. "You know what," he said, glancing at Maria, "I've got half a mind to file a report about that guy. The way he spoke to you, it wasn't just unprofessional. It was discriminatory." Maria considered his words. She knew he was right, but the idea of going through more conflict, more paperwork, more explanations, especially in her current condition, felt overwhelming. Still, she couldn't ignore what had happened. It wasn't just about her. It was about making sure something like this didn't happen to someone else. "Maybe we should," she said after a long pause. "But can we do it after the Ferris wheel?" David chuckled softly, squeezing her shoulder. "Absolutely. Let's make sure Adam gets his ride first." As they approached the towering Ferris wheel, the sun beginning to set behind it, casting a golden glow over the park, Maria allowed herself a moment of peace. This day had been far from perfect, but they were here, together, and they had overcome something. And that, at least, was worth celebrating. Shadows of the past. The Ferris wheel rose high above them, its colorful lights flickering in the early evening twilight. Adam's excitement seemed to return as they neared the ride, his earlier worry replaced by the pure joy of anticipation. Maria, still shaken from the encounter at the gate, let herself be swept up in his energy. She needed this moment of calm, something to remind her that today wasn't ruined, that there was still room for happiness. David walked beside her in silence, his hand resting protectively on the handle of her wheelchair. Though he was trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Adam's sake, Maria could feel the tension radiating from him. He was always the protector, the calm in the storm, but she knew him well enough to sense that something had shifted inside him too. David had a remarkable ability to compartmentalize his emotions, a skill honed over years of working in high-stakes situations as an FBI agent. But when it came to his family, that protective barrier was thinner. As they reached the front of the line, the park attendant, a young woman in her 20s, smiled warmly at them, her demeanor a stark contrast to the hostility they had just encountered at the gate. "Welcome," she said cheerfully. "Do you need assistance getting into the carriage?" "Yes, please," David replied, flashing a grateful smile. He helped Maria maneuver herself into the specially equipped Ferris wheel carriage, while Adam hopped in next to her. The attendant secured the wheelchair lock and double-checked the safety measures before stepping back. "Enjoy the ride," she called as the wheel began to move. As the giant wheel slowly lifted them into the sky, Maria allowed herself to relax for the first time in hours. The park below them grew smaller, the noisy hum of the crowd fading into the background as they rose higher into the air. Adam pressed his face against the window, his eyes wide with awe. "Look, Mommy, I can see everything from up here," he exclaimed, his earlier worries forgotten in the thrill of the ride. His small hand reached out for hers, and Maria squeezed it gently, feeling a warmth in her chest that momentarily pushed aside the events of the day. For a few precious moments, everything was peaceful. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the air was cool, and the world below seemed far away. Maria closed her eyes, breathing deeply, savoring the tranquility. But even as she tried to relax, her mind kept returning to the confrontation at the entrance, replaying the guard's words, the looks from the crowd, the disbelief in the police officer's eyes. David, seated on the opposite side of the carriage, was watching her carefully. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of her wheelchair, a sure sign that her mind was still racing. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" David asked softly. Maria opened her eyes and looked at him, offering a weak smile. "I can't help it," she admitted. "It's hard to shake." It felt personal, like he'd already made up his mind about me before I even said a word. David nodded, his face unreadable. He glanced at Adam, who was still lost in the wonder of the Ferris wheel, before turning back to Maria. "It was personal," he said quietly. "I saw it the moment I walked up. That wasn't just a misunderstanding about your paperwork. He was targeting you because of who you are." Maria sighed, her chest tightening at the thought. "I know," she whispered. "I could feel it. But part of me wonders if it was just me being sensitive. Maybe I'm overreacting." David's expression hardened. "You're not overreacting. What happened wasn't okay, and you have every right to feel the way you do." Maria looked out at the horizon, the city skyline now visible in the distance. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want Adam to see all of that." David's gaze softened as he reached across the carriage to take her hand. "You did everything right," he said. "You stayed calm, you stood your ground, and you made sure Adam knew he was safe. That's what matters." Maria appreciated his words, but there was still a part of her that felt unsettled. She had grown up knowing that the world wasn't always kind to people who looked like her. As a black woman, she had encountered her fair share of prejudice, both subtle and overt. But this was different. She had never been made to feel so powerless, so small, especially in front of her child. The helplessness she had felt sitting in that wheelchair, unable to physically stand up for herself, had cut deeper than she had expected. The Ferris wheel continued its slow rotation, the world below them seeming almost peaceful from their elevated perch. But Maria couldn't shake the memories of her past, the time she had been told she didn't belong, the time she had been made to feel like an outsider, even in places she had every right to be. She hadn't always been so restrained. There had been a time when Maria would have fought back more aggressively, when she would have raised her voice and demanded the respect she deserved. But after years of navigating the world as both a black woman and a mother, she had learned that fighting back wasn't always the best option. Sometimes, the quiet battles were the ones that made the most impact. As the Ferris wheel neared the top, the highest point in its slow revolution, Maria felt a sudden wave of emotion wash over her. It was a mix of anger, exhaustion, and deep-seated pain. Feelings that had been building inside her for years, but that she had rarely let herself fully acknowledge. The confrontation at the park had reopened old wounds, reminding her of the countless times she had been judged, dismissed, and underestimated because of the color of her skin. David seemed to sense the shift in her mood. He leaned forward, his voice low but full of concern. "Talk to me, Maria," he said. "What's going on in your head?" Maria hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted to let the flood of emotions spill out. But as she looked at her husband, the man who had always stood by her, always fought for her, she knew she didn't have to carry the weight of it alone. "It's not just about today," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about everything. It's about all the times I've been made to feel like I don't belong, like I'm not enough. It's about the way people look at me and assume the worst before I even open my mouth. And now it's about our son. I don't want him to grow up in a world where he has to see his mother treated like that." David's face softened, his own pain mirrored in her words. He had seen it too, had experienced it himself in different ways. Though he was often shielded by his role as an FBI agent, he knew that when he took off that badge, he was just another black man in America, subject to the same biases, the same assumptions. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "And I hate that you've had to carry that for so long. But you're not alone in this, Maria. We'll face it together, for ourselves and for Adam." Maria nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not now. She had always prided herself on being strong, on holding things together. But today, she realized, maybe it was okay to let herself feel vulnerable. Maybe it was okay to acknowledge that sometimes the world could be cruel, and that even the strongest people needed to lean on those they loved. The Ferris wheel began its descent, the park below growing larger again as they slowly returned to the ground. Adam, still blissfully unaware of the depth of his parents' conversation, bounced excitedly in his seat. "That was awesome, Mommy. Can we go again?" Maria laughed softly, her heart lighter than it had been just moments before. "Maybe later, sweetie," she said, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "Let's find something else to do first." David smiled at the exchange, but his mind was still on the conversation they had just had. He wasn't done with this. He knew Maria too well, knew that she would try to brush off the hurt, to move forward without fully addressing what had happened. But he also knew that for the sake of their family, they needed to confront it, to stand up against the forces that had tried to diminish them. As the ride came to a stop and the attendant opened the door, David helped Maria back into her wheelchair. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park, but the air was still warm and inviting. They had the rest of the evening ahead of them, and despite everything, Maria was determined to make it a day her son would remember for all the right reasons. But in the back of her mind, she knew that today's confrontation was just one of many. The world wasn't going to change overnight, and there would be more battles to fight. For Adam, for herself, and for all the people who had been told they didn't belong. As they moved through the park, David's hand on the back of her chair and Adam skipping ahead, Maria felt a renewed sense of determination. The shadows of the past might linger, but they would not define her future. Together, they would push forward, standing tall in the face of whatever challenges came next. And this time, they wouldn't back down. A day of reckoning. As they navigated the bustling park, the warm twilight surrounding them, Maria couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in David's demeanor. He was quiet, his usual easygoing smile replaced by a more serious expression. He stayed close to her wheelchair, his hand occasionally resting on the back, a silent reminder that he was there, that he always would be there. But Maria knew her husband well enough to recognize the thoughts swirling behind his calm exterior. David wasn't done with what had happened earlier. He wasn't one to let things slide when it came to his family. And Maria, though tired from the day's events, understood why. For years, they had both dealt with the microaggressions and open hostility that came with living in a world where people of color were often seen as less than. But this time, it had happened in front of their son, and that fact alone made it impossible for David to let go. Adam, blissfully unaware of the heaviness lingering between his parents, skipped ahead of them, bouncing from one attraction to the next. His excitement was infectious, and for a while, Maria allowed herself to be drawn into his world again. She smiled as Adam ran toward a nearby game stand, his eyes lighting up at the sight of giant stuffed animals hanging as prizes. "Mommy, Daddy, can we try to win one?" Adam asked, his voice filled with the kind of hope only a child could muster. Maria exchanged a glance with David, who finally broke into a grin. "Sure thing, buddy," David said, walking toward the game stand. "Let's see if I still have my old throwing arm." The man running the game, an older gentleman with graying hair and a friendly smile, handed David 3 small rubber balls. The game was simple. Knock down all the stacked bottles, and you could pick a prize. Adam watched with rapt attention as his father took aim at the pyramid of bottles. David's first throw missed entirely, and Adam groaned in disappointment, though he was still grinning. "Come on, Daddy. You can do better than that." David winked at his son, took a deep breath, and threw the second ball with more focus. This time, it hit the target, sending the bottles clattering to the ground. Adam jumped up and down, cheering as if David had just won the Super Bowl. "That's my boy," Maria teased, clapping softly as David handed the last ball to Adam. Now let's see if you've got the magic touch, kiddo. Adam took the ball, his small hands barely able to grip it, and with a determined look on his face, he hurled it toward the remaining bottles. The ball missed by a wide margin, but he laughed, undeterred by the failure. The man running the stand chuckled good-naturedly and handed Adam a small consolation prize, an oversized lollipop. "Thanks." Adam beamed as he clutched the candy, his joy unbroken by the loss. "This is awesome." For a moment, everything felt normal again. Maria laughed as David tried to steal a bite of Adam's lollipop, only to have his hand playfully swatted away by their son. It was moments like these that reminded her why they kept pushing forward, why they refused to let the world's ugliness define their happiness. But even as they enjoyed the simple pleasures of the evening, Maria could sense David's mind ticking away, still focused on what had happened earlier. After a few more games, they stopped at a nearby food stand to grab dinner. They found a quiet spot under a tree, away from the crowds, where they could eat in peace. Adam was too busy devouring his hot dog to notice the tension between his parents, but Maria could feel it. She knew David was waiting for the right moment to bring it up. As the sky darkened and the twinkling lights of the park lit up around them, David finally broke the silence. "Maria," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made her look up from her food. "We need to talk about what happened earlier." Maria had been expecting this, but even so, she felt a knot form in her stomach. She set down her half-eaten sandwich and met his gaze. "I know," she replied quietly. "I've been thinking about it too." David sighed, running a hand over his short hair. "I can't let it go," he said, his voice tight. "That guy, he was way out of line. It wasn't just about the paperwork. He was profiling you, treating you like you were trying to scam him. And I can't." He stopped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I can't let that stand. Not when Adam was there. Not when he had to see his mother treated like that." Maria's heart ached at the raw emotion in David's voice. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt. Hurt that his wife had been humiliated in front of their child. Hurt that Adam had to witness the reality of prejudice at such a young age. And as much as Maria wanted to move past it, she knew David was right. This wasn't something they could ignore. "I agree," she said softly. "It wasn't just about me. It's about what Adam saw, what he's learning about the world. We can't shield him from everything, but we need to show him that we won't accept this kind of treatment." David's eyes softened as he looked at her, his love for her evident in the way his expression shifted from anger to concern. "Exactly," he said. "We need to set an example. For him. For ourselves." Maria took a deep breath. "So what do we do? Report the guard? File a complaint with the park?" David leaned back against the tree, thinking carefully. "We could start with that," he said slowly. "But I think it needs to go further. The way he treated you. It wasn't just about you being in a wheelchair. It was about race. He saw a black woman and assumed you were trying to cheat the system. That's the kind of bias that runs deeper than just one bad employee. The park needs to know that this isn't acceptable." Maria nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "You're right," she said. "But I just don't want this to turn into a long, drawn-out battle. I'm exhausted, David. Mentally, physically, emotionally. I don't know if I have the energy for a fight right now." David reached over and took her hand, his fingers gently squeezing hers. "I know you're tired," he said softly, "and I don't want to put any more on your plate. But I can't let this slide. Not when it's about protecting you. Protecting Adam. I'll handle it, okay? I'll file the report, talk to the park management. I won't push you to be involved if you don't want to be." Maria looked at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. David had always been her rock, her protector, but he also respected her boundaries. He understood her exhaustion without needing her to explain it, and he was willing to take on the burden of the fight for her sake. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hand back. "I don't know what I'd do without you." David smiled softly. "You'd be just fine," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You're the strongest person I know." They sat in silence for a few moments, letting the weight of the conversation settle between them. Adam, still oblivious to the heaviness of his parents' discussion, had finished his food and was now playing with his new lollipop, swinging it around like a sword as he pretended to battle imaginary villains. Maria watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. She wanted so much for him to grow up in a world where he wouldn't have to face the same challenges she and David had faced. But she knew that wasn't the world they lived in. The best they could do was teach him resilience, strength, and the courage to stand up for what was right. "Mommy, look." Adam's voice broke through her thoughts as he ran up to her, holding out his lollipop like a trophy. "I defeated the bad guys." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's my brave boy," she said, ruffling his hair. "You're going to be a great hero someday." David chuckled softly, standing up and stretching. "He already is," he said, reaching down to help Maria back into her wheelchair. "Come on, buddy. Let's go find some more villains to defeat." As they made their way through the park, the evening air growing cooler, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. The day had been long, and there were battles still to fight. But for now, she had her family by her side. And that was enough. But as they walked, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that today had marked a turning point, both for herself and for David. They had always faced the world's challenges together, but this time felt different. The confrontation at the park had opened old wounds, exposed the deep-rooted biases that still existed, and now there was no going back. David would file the report. The park would investigate, or at least they would pretend to. And maybe, just maybe, something would change. But Maria knew better than to hope for miracles. The fight for justice was never easy, never quick. It was a long, hard road, and they were only at the beginning. As the park's lights twinkled around them, and Adam's laughter filled the rising above, the glow of the amusement park illuminated their path as Maria, David, and Adam ventured deeper into the vibrant surroundings. The air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of popcorn and cotton candy, and the laughter of children echoed like music, providing a stark contrast to the turmoil of earlier. Yet, as Maria savored the fleeting moments of joy, the weight of the day's events lingered in the back of her mind. Adam's enthusiasm was infectious, and for now, it was enough to push away the darker thoughts that threatened to resurface. He led them toward a nearby ride, a whimsical carousel adorned with colorful horses and glittering lights. "Can we go on that one next, Mommy?" he asked, pointing excitedly. Maria glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Absolutely. Let's do it," she replied, mustering all the cheer she could manage. The sight of her son's joy, his face lit up with excitement, made the weight of her earlier worries feel just a little lighter. As they waited in line for the carousel, Maria watched the other children, their laughter ringing through the air, and she felt a bittersweet pang in her heart. It was in moments like these that she yearned for a world free of prejudice, a place where her son could grow up without the burden of the biases that had so often tainted their lives. But as she stood there, she also recognized that she had the power to shape that future. When it was their turn, Maria positioned her wheelchair next to one of the majestic horses. The attendant, a young woman with bright blue hair and a welcoming smile, leaned down to help secure Maria's chair so that she could enjoy the ride with Adam. "We want everyone to have fun, no matter how they get here," she said cheerfully, flashing Maria a knowing look that made her feel seen. As the carousel began to spin, the world transformed into a blur of colors and lights. Adam squealed in delight, holding on tightly to the wooden horse as it rose and fell with the rhythm of the ride. Maria couldn't help but laugh, her heart swelling with love for her son. This was what it was all about, creating memories, fostering joy, and enjoying the simple pleasures in life. But even as she soaked in the happiness of the moment, Maria felt a flicker of determination igniting within her. The earlier confrontation had opened her eyes to the systemic issues that still plagued society, issues that she could no longer ignore. It was clear that silence would not shield her family from the world's injustices. They needed to take action. As they exited the carousel, Adam was buzzing with excitement. "Can we get ice cream now?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Of course," David replied, grinning at Maria. "We've earned a treat after that ride." They made their way to the ice cream stand, where the vibrant display of flavors tempted them all. As Maria contemplated her options, she overheard a nearby conversation. Two women discussing the incident that had unfolded earlier. "Did you see that poor woman in the wheelchair? How could that security guard be so rude?" One of them said, shaking her head. "It's just unbelievable." "Right? It's like he didn't even see her, just assumed she was trying to cheat the system," the other woman responded. Maria's heart raced at their words, her instincts kicking in. This was exactly what she had hoped for. People noticing, speaking up, and recognizing the injustices that often went unnoticed. Fueled by this realization, she turned to David. "I think we should talk to them," she said, her voice steady. David raised an eyebrow, a hint of concern etched on his face. "Are you sure? You don't have to if you're not feeling up to it." "No, I want to," Maria replied, feeling a surge of courage. "If they're already discussing it, maybe they'll understand why it's important to take a stand. This isn't just about me. It's about creating awareness." With a nod of approval from David, they approached the two women. Maria took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, and introduced herself. "Hi, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I'm Maria, and that situation at the gate earlier was mine." The women turned to her, their expressions shifting from surprise to empathy. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," one of them said, her eyes widening in concern. "It was awful to witness." "It really was," the other woman chimed in. "I couldn't believe how rude that guard was. You deserve to be treated with respect, especially when you're just trying to enjoy a day with your family." Maria felt a warmth spread through her at their support. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "It's hard to explain how much those kinds of interactions impact us. It's not just about that moment. It's about the underlying biases that people carry." The first woman nodded thoughtfully. "We've all seen it. People being treated unfairly, whether it's because of their race, their gender, or their ability. It's infuriating. I believe it's important for all of us to stand up when we see something wrong." Maria continued, feeling more confident. "We can't let these moments slide by. It's time to speak up and create change." The two women exchanged glances, and Maria could see the determination in their eyes. "You're right," the second woman said. "We should definitely do something. Maybe we can all file a complaint together or raise awareness on social media." "Absolutely," Maria agreed. "The more people know about it, the harder it is for these things to be swept under the rug." As they discussed potential actions they could take, David stood by, watching his wife with pride. He could see how passionately she spoke, how her voice carried the weight of her experiences, and he knew that she was on the path to becoming an advocate not just for herself, but for others who had faced similar challenges. After exchanging contact information with the women, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the beginning of something bigger. They would share their stories, raise awareness, and push for change, starting with their community and hopefully inspiring others along the way. As the evening wore on, they continued to enjoy the park, Adam darting between rides, laughter ringing in the air. The earlier confrontation faded into the background, replaced by moments of joy, connection, and resilience. They explored more attractions, shared ice cream, and relished the time spent together as a family. But Maria knew this was just the first step. They would write their complaint together, share their story online, and reach out to advocacy groups to find support. She wanted to ensure that their voices were heard, that the incident would spark change in a system that often silenced those who were marginalized. That night, as they settled into their hotel room, Maria took a moment to reflect. Adam was already asleep, his small body sprawled out on the bed, clutching his lollipop tightly. David sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone, but he looked up as Maria walked over, a sense of determination in his eyes. "Are you ready to write this?" he asked, his voice low. Maria nodded, her heart racing with anticipation and a hint of trepidation. "Yes, let's do it." They spent the next few hours crafting their complaint, pouring their hearts into every word. They wrote about the encounter at the park, how it had made them feel, and why it was crucial for the park management to address the issue. David offered his insights, weaving in his experiences as an FBI agent and his understanding of systemic bias. By the time they finished, it was late, but Maria felt invigorated. They had taken control of their narrative, transforming a painful experience into an opportunity for advocacy. As they finally crawled into bed, exhaustion washed over them, but the weight of the day felt lighter. Maria nestled into David's side, and he wrapped his arm around her protectively. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for standing with me," Maria replied, her voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you." They drifted into sleep, but Maria knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for respect, and for dignity would be long, but they were ready to face it together. They would not shy away from confronting the hard truths of their world. In the morning, they would send their complaint, but tonight, they had each other, and that was enough.